Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We are going to start off this time with one last chalice description. Let's see how it lines up with the template we've just put together. Desecrated Chalice, one of the holy chalices that breaks the seal of the underground ruins. However, this desecrated chalice is cursed. A curse is proof that the wrath of the higher rank ones has been touched. It is a malediction. To complete this ritual, a special material is necessary. If you would attempt a curse, search for Bastards of Loran. So obviously we're seeing a deviation in the pattern of the text here, with some unique phrasing worked into what I think is still recognizable as part of the broader template. That is, you can still arguably break down this description into two main sections, beginning with some information about this chalice and followed by the definition of a new feature of the labyrinth. Obviously, the first line is the standard text for a chalice that leads to a fixed dungeon, the main purpose of what I've been calling Section 1A. Then for Section 1B, which concerns the special features of a given chalice, we're now introduced to a cursed variant, which tells us in no uncertain terms that this chalice is cursed. More interesting, though, is the way the rest of the description is structured similarly to the top-level chalices for the Hintertombs and Loran, except instead of defining and describing a region, it defines curses and tells players how to interact with them. The definitional section even opens in Japanese with the word for curse, followed by the particle combination to and wa, like we saw in the initial Loran and Hintertomb chalices. The ultimate effect of this, combined with the unique text, is to make this chalice feel like a new beginning for Tumuru, alongside the introduction of the curse mechanic, which I think is appropriate considering where it fits in the overall sequence of chalices. But there's more to this chalice than just the way it plays with the chalice description template. For one thing, there's the name of the item. Viewers of my Chalice Chats series may recall that I've mentioned I typically associate the term botoku, from botoku no seihai, with the concept of blasphemy. It turns out the definition is somewhat broader than that, but even so, this item could arguably be understood as something like the blasphemous chalice or the holy chalice of desecration. By this understanding, it could potentially be seen as a holy chalice deemed blasphemous, or a chalice meant to worship the unholy. However, looking into the description to see that this chalice has been cursed completely recontextualizes the name of this item. This isn't a holy chalice that defiles things, it is a holy object that itself has been profaned by being cursed. In other words, it's best understood as a desecrated or defiled chalice. Given that understanding, though, there's something about the middle section of this item description that arguably works better in Japanese than in the official English. This comes down to a slight difference in presentation, which is that in the original language, there's no discussion of what causes curses. Instead, there's a pair of linked sentences that provide a definition for the concept of a curse. The first sentence essentially states that a curse is proof that the wrath of the Great Ones has been incurred, and the second sentence provides a synonym, explaining that a curse is a malediction. The Japanese word used here is juso, which is a noun that describes the act of calling upon gods or evil spirits to bring harm to someone. In summary, then, a curse is a thing that involves calling on the Great Ones to bring harm to others and which signifies their stirred-up wrath. The first part of this idea comes through clearly in the official English, but by saying that curses are caused by inciting the anger of the Great Ones, I think it obscures an implication in the Japanese that this chalice being cursed is evidence that the Tumerians did something to anger the Great Ones. That said, part of the purpose of this description seems to be about how to perform a curse, so formulating this information in a way that highlights the active role of someone doing the cursing does make sense to me. Anyway, we'll revisit the subject of curses closer to the time when we return to the Defiled Chalice. For now, let's move on to something else we found in the old labyrinth. Beast Claw, the beast weapon used by apostate Izzy. This weapon, made by stealing the long bones of an abominable undead black beast, then carving them and binding them together, is still alive. By unleashing it, the user is temporarily guided to beasthood. Beasthood is increased by attacks, by rent and wounded flesh, as well as back-spattered blood. Continuing to do these things will likely bring the user ever greater power and pleasure. Clearly, this is a weapon with some unsettling aspects, and since this is something I think the official translation does a particularly good job of emphasizing, I wanted to start by highlighting some choices I find highly effective. For one thing, there are the closing lines of the description. Just the opening of, as flesh is flayed and blood is sprayed, I think does a great job of conveying through word choice the intensity of these actions. And concluding by talking about how the wielder of this weapon surges with strength and feverish reverie really drives that home. If this weapon is meant to make its wielder slowly succumb to a beastly bloodlust even as they grow stronger, this description does a great job of making the player feel what that transformation would be like with its phrasing. Another touch I especially like here comes in the line just before this final section, where rather than describe how this weapon temporarily guides its user to a beast state, it speaks of granting a spurt of beastly power. The use of the word spurt, I think, is a particularly nice touch because it at once conveys the relevant mechanical information, which is that this state of beasthood does not last forever, and it fits the beastly organic theming of the weapon itself, along with the nature of that power. In other words, it manages to minimize the impact of one of the trade-offs made in the final lines of this description, which is that some of the practical information on how this weapon works in the game is obscured. You see, one of the key features of this weapon is that when you activate its transformed mode, you enter the same state as if you had used a beast blood pellet. A beasthood meter appears on screen, and as it fills, you both do more damage to enemies and take more damage when hit. In Japanese, the same term, jusei, is used in the middle and end of this description, as well as at similar points in the description for the beast blood pellet. This makes it clearer that the term is being used to describe the same mechanic than the English, which uses beasthood, beastly power, and the beast within. Given this clarity, when the Japanese description notes that beasthood is increased by attacks, and that continuing to do so likely leads to greater strength, it's not hard to understand that this is telling players that continuing to attack will increase their damage based on the level of their beasthood. Also, it's arguably easier to connect the beast claw with the beast blood pellet in Japanese, because the final lines of both descriptions are exactly the same, whereas the official English uses two different, if similar, translations. Having described these trade-offs, though, I personally believe they're worth it. I think that there are enough similarities remaining between the Beast Claw and the Beast Blood Pellet for players to make the necessary connection without needing to have identical text at the end. Also, the description of the weapon's mechanics can be understood through gameplay, if nothing else, which should help players see what the description is getting at mechanically in retrospect if they don't get it beforehand. On the subject of seeing things in action, though, there's one last issue I wanted to discuss with regards to the translation of this item description. You may have noticed that in my more literal version, I described the beast claw as a weapon made by fastening together the bones of a dark beast, while the official version indicates that the bones were fastened to an existing weapon. Well, the Japanese is kind of confusing here. It's clear that the bones have been bound to something, but it's not really specified if they've been attached to one another or to this weapon. In fact, the line break in the original emphasizes how the word for fastened to is modifying the phrase this weapon, making that interpretation seem most likely. Looking at the image for the weapon, though, I find the opposite interpretation a better fit, since that makes it clear that the carved bones joined together are the primary part of this weapon, rather than things bound to an existing one. I take this as more evidence that the visuals for the game weren't available to the translators, because if they were, the nature of the weapon's construction would have been clearer. Of course, as this next item shows, visuals don't always help. Haze Carving Workshop Tool. One of the workshop tools lost from the hunter's dream. The hunter who recovers this will be able to carve ritual materials to gain haze of holy mystery. However, materials with their haze carved out will be completely lost. As you can see, this is a pretty straightforward translation, but there are a couple touches here that I think are really nice. First, there's the name, and this gets back to the visual issue I mentioned before reading the item description, because the Japanese name for this item, both by itself and in combination with the image used for it, actually leave me with a lot more questions than the English. In the original language, this is called the kasumi kezuri no koubou dougu. The last part, koubou dougu, just means workshop tool. So the operative word here is kasumi kezuri, and as I've literally translated it, it means haze carving. The specific formulation it uses, though, that of a noun plus the word kezuri, fits in with an existing pattern from the real world. For instance, the Japanese word for pencil sharpener is enpitsu kezuri, with the enpitsu meaning pencil and kezuri meaning carver, with the idea being that the action of the tool is to carve away the end of the pencil so that it becomes sharp. By implication, then, the point of this tool is to carve the haze off of ritual materials, just like how in English you would expect a haze carver to carve haze. But later in the description, it's explicitly said to carve ritual materials. I find this a little confusing, though I guess if you consider a material only to be complete with its haze intact, it makes some sense. Then again, if you look at the tool pictured, it appears to be either an ice pick or a type of awl, which I find only confuses me more. If this is an awl, perhaps meant to bore a hole through materials to draw out the arcane haze, why is there a reference being made to carving? If this is an ice pick, I have even more questions. Given how prominently this game features madness, is this meant to be a reference to lobotomies? If so, why is it used for removing the arcane haze from things like mold, flowers, and incoagulable blood, as opposed to destroying the brain? How would an ice pick even be used to extract this haze? At least ice picks are used to carve ice, with a matching term in both languages, so the verb makes sense. Anyway, what I like about this item's English name is that it speaks directly to this tool's function, which is to extract arcane haze. The image may still be confusing, but the verb is perfectly clear. And speaking of verbs, the one other thing I wanted to point out involves a verb ending at the end of this description. The Japanese here is ushinawarete shimau, which is a form of the verb to lose. But the specific form it's in, ending in te shimau, has a specific set of nuances in Japanese that implies two things. First, that the verb in question is complete, and second, that there's something unpleasant or sad about it being in that completed state. For example, if I were to say, "Cookie o zenbu tabete shimatta," I would be saying that I ate all the cookies, and implying that there was something bad about that. Perhaps that now there are no more cookies for me to eat. Anyway, what I like about the translation here in Bloodborne is that it includes this specific nuance by adding the word alas to the final sentence in English. And alas, it's time to move on. Iron Helm of Yahar'gul, an iron helmet worn by the hunters of the Hidden Ward. That, with its black hood taken off, makes one think of warriors from a previous era. This protective mask is one of the rare pieces of hunter attire made of metal, and has a high defensive value purely in regards to physical attacks. Now, if that sounded familiar, that's likely because most of this description is reused from the black hooded iron helm. Only the short middle section is actually unique to this item. But unlike the variants we've seen for the student uniform and the hunter garb, the changes here are fairly significant. This time the item has been renamed, and the change to the item's description involves the removal and replacement of several lines of text, whereas most similar variations only change a few words. This, I think, lends this particular item an interesting level of significance, and since the translation here is fairly straightforward, that's actually what I'd like to focus on. Basically, I see this as a small-scale parallel to one of the core themes of the game, which is about uncovering hidden truths. Very little in the world of Bloodborne is exactly as it seems, and this is true on several levels. At the start of the game, the state of the world is being hidden, the moon appears normal, and we're unable to see the amygdalas and other effects kept from those without sufficient insight. On a more practical level, there's also the trick weapons, which conceal the true extent of their abilities. In terms of genre, there's a lot of gothic horror in the game, but the further you progress, the more it takes on elements of cosmic horror as well. Even the NPCs will try to trick you, with one who impersonates a doctor, another that's a beast in human form, and others whose appearance or demeanor can be misleading. Well, it's this same idea of hidden truths that I think this group of items ties into. When we first find the black-hooded iron helm, its name doesn't quite fit with the rest of its set, and one of the lines that later gets changed emphasizes how the black hood is worn low over the eyes, likely in part as a way of keeping what's underneath hidden. Then, when we get the Iron Yahar'gul Helm, its name better matches the rest of the set, and that which was hidden beneath the hood is now fully revealed. This also coincides with our discovery of the full extent of Yahar'gul itself, which is only possible after exposing the Red Moon. I also wonder if the connection to the ancient past is significant here, but as we've reached the end of the episode, I'll simply leave that as something to ponder. As always, please let me know if you have any feedback for me, and until next time, thanks for watching, everyone.